Captain Park Ji-hoon had flown 847 commercial flights in his 9-year career, and he could count on one hand the number of times he'd felt truly present during any of them. The rest blurred together, a sequence of pre-flight checks, weather briefings, vectored approaches, and the mechanical smile he offered passengers who occasionally peeked into the cockpit during boarding. At 34, he was one of the youngest captains at Pacific Wings International, a distinction that meant nothing to him beyond the extra weight of expectation it carried. He sat now in the captain's seat of a Boeing 777, waiting for the final passenger count from the purser, watching Seoul's Incheon Airport shimmer in the late afternoon heat outside his windscreen. First Officer Choi sat beside him, younger, more talkative, filling the silence with commentary about his weekend plans. Ji-hoon offered the appropriate sounds of acknowledgement while his mind calculated fuel burn rates and the weather system developing over the Pacific. His life had become this, a series of calculated movements, professional courtesies, and the vast loneliness of hotel rooms in cities where he knew no one and wanted to know no one. His mother called every Sunday to ask about marriage prospects. His father had stopped asking, which somehow felt worse. The cockpit door opened, and the purser stepped in with the final paperwork. Ji-hoon glanced up automatically, ready to receive the passenger manifest, but the purser wasn't alone. Behind him stood a flight attendant Ji-hoon didn't recognize, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, his carefully maintained professional demeanor stuttered. She was tall, with dark skin that caught the afternoon light, her hair pulled back in the standard uniform style, but with a grace that made even the airline's rigid dress code look elegant. Her eyes met his briefly as the purser introduced her, Captain Park. This is Adanna Okafor. She's new to the international routes, and Ji-hoon felt something he couldn't immediately name shift in his chest. Captain, she said, her voice carrying the faint music of an accent he couldn't place, and he realized he was staring. Welcome aboard, he managed, and the words sounded stiff even to his own ears. She nodded once, a small professional smile, and followed the purser back out. First Officer Choi whistled low. New hire. Nigerian, I heard. Transferred from the Lagos route. Ji-hoon said nothing, already resetting his focus to the departure checklist, but something had changed in the air of the cockpit, and he couldn't explain what or why. The flight to Los Angeles was unremarkable. 11 hours of managed automation, periodic checks, and the quiet rhythm of long-haul flying that Ji-hoon had long ago mastered. But twice during the flight, when the senior purser brought coffee and the meal service briefings, he found himself looking for her in the galley beyond the cockpit door. He caught glimpses, her moving through the cabin with practiced efficiency, her hands demonstrating safety procedures during the pre-flight announcement, her profile as she spoke to a passenger in row 23. He told himself it meant nothing. He'd flown with hundreds of flight attendants over the years. This was no different. But when they landed at LAX and completed the post-flight procedures, when he gathered his flight bag and made his way through the jet bridge, he found himself scanning the terminal for her without quite admitting to himself that was what he was doing. The crew van to the hotel was crowded, and she sat 3 rows behind him. He could hear her laugh at something another flight attendant said, and the sound was warmer than the recycled air of the Boeing cabin, more real than anything he'd heard in months. At the hotel, during the check-in process that always felt interminable after a transpacific flight, he stood in line behind the first officer and 2 flight attendants. She was ahead of him, waiting for her room key, and when she turned to leave the front desk, their eyes met again. Long flight, she said, and it wasn't really a conversation starter, just an acknowledgement. They all are, Ji-hoon replied, and immediately regretted how cold it sounded. But she smiled slightly, as if she understood something he hadn't said, and moved toward the elevators. He didn't see her again that layover. The company policy was clear. Flight crews were expected to maintain professional distance during layovers, and fraternization between cockpit crew and cabin crew was explicitly forbidden in the employee handbook he'd signed years ago. Paragraph 7, Section C. He'd never thought about it before, never had reason to. His life was a careful structure of rules and protocols, and he'd never wanted to disturb it. But that night, in his hotel room on the 14th floor, staring at the Los Angeles skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, Ji-hoon found himself thinking about the way light had moved across her face in the cockpit, the particular cadence of her voice. And he felt the first hairline crack in the armor he'd built around himself. Adanna Okafor had learned to make herself smaller. Not physically, at 5'9", she would always stand out in the regimented rows of flight attendants during briefings, but energetically, emotionally. She'd learned to read rooms, to sense when her presence was welcome and when it was tolerated, and after 6 years working for Pacific Wings, first on domestic African routes and now internationally, she could navigate the complex social hierarchies of airline culture with practiced precision. The Korean pilots were the hardest to read. They maintained a professional distance that felt less like courtesy and more like a wall. They barely made eye contact during safety briefings, spoke in clipped sentences during meal services, and never lingered in galleys or aisles. She'd heard the stories from other flight attendants, the strict hierarchy, the unspoken rules, the way cabin crew were expected to remain deferential and largely invisible to the flight deck. Captain Park had looked at her, though. Just for a moment in the cockpit during that first introduction, she'd seen something flicker across his face before the professional mask returned. She told herself it meant nothing. She'd seen that look before: curiosity, surprise, sometimes something less pleasant. Being a Nigerian woman in a Korean-dominated airline meant constantly navigating other people's assumptions about who you were and what you were worth. But there had been something different in his eyes. Not surprise at her presence, but surprise at his own reaction to it. She unpacked her uniform in the LAX hotel room, hung it carefully in the closet, and tried to shake off the exhaustion that came with 11-hour flights and the 3-hour time difference. Her phone buzzed, a message from her younger sister in Lagos, asking about money for school fees. Another message from her mother, asking when she'd visit. Another from her ex-boyfriend, which she deleted without reading. The weight of other people's needs pressed down on her shoulders like the cabin pressure she'd learned to ignore. She was 29, had a university degree she'd never used, and spent her life moving through the sky in service to people who rarely remembered her name. It was better than the alternatives. It paid well enough to support her family from a distance. It was safe, stable, respectable. It was also slowly erasing her. She'd come to Pacific Wings with dreams of seeing the world, of building something larger than the narrow expectations Lagos had for women like her. But 6 years in, the world looked mostly like airport terminals and hotel rooms, and the dreams had been filed away in the same mental drawer where she kept all the other things she'd stopped believing in. That night, she went down to the hotel gym because sleep was impossible and sitting alone with her thoughts felt worse. The gym was empty except for one other person on the far treadmill, and she was 3 minutes into her run before she realized it was him, Captain Park, in civilian clothes, running with the same focused intensity she'd seen in the cockpit. He noticed her at the same moment, and for a second they both faltered in their strides. Then he nodded once, a minimal acknowledgement, and returned his attention to his run. Adanna told herself to leave. The gym was small, too intimate for a captain and flight attendant to share space, without it feeling like a violation of those unspoken rules. But she'd been making herself smaller for 6 years, had spent her entire life accommodating other people's comfort, and something in her, something tired and defiant, refused to leave. She ran. He ran. 20 minutes of parallel solitude, the only sound the rhythm of feet on treadmills and the low hum of the hotel's climate control system. When he finally slowed to a stop and grabbed his towel, she expected him to leave without a word. Instead, he paused near her treadmill, and when she glanced over, he was looking at her with an expression that seemed to cost him something. First time on the LAX route, he asked, and his voice was different outside the cockpit, less formal, though still careful. Second, Adanna said, slowing her pace. First was last month. Different captain. He nodded as if this was important information. How are you finding the international flights? It was such a bland question, the kind of small talk that meant nothing, but the way he asked it, as if her answer actually mattered, made her pause. Longer, she said. More complicated. The passengers expect more, but they also see less. You're just part of the machinery. Something shifted in his expression, a recognition. Yes, he said quietly. Exactly that. They stood there in the artificial light of the hotel gym, and Adanna felt the dangerous pull of connection, the recognition of shared loneliness. She should make an excuse, retreat to her room, maintain the professional distance that kept everyone safe. I'm Ji-hoon, he said, and it took her a moment to understand the significance of him offering his first name. Outside of work. When we're not in uniform. Adanna, she replied, and the exchange felt weighted with something neither of them could acknowledge. I should let you finish your run, he said, and she heard the reluctance in his voice, the same reluctance she felt at ending this small moment of human contact. Good night, Captain, she said, returning them both to safe ground. Ji-hoon, he corrected softly. Here, at least. Then he left, and Adanna stood on the treadmill, her heart rate elevated for reasons that had nothing to do with exercise, knowing she'd just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Over the next 4 months, they flew together 6 more times. Pacific Wings rotated crew assignments based on availability and schedule, and the algorithm that determined who flew with whom cared nothing for the careful distance Ji-hoon tried to maintain, or the way Adanna found herself checking the crew manifest the moment it posted. Each flight followed the same pattern: professional courtesies, minimal eye contact, the strict adherence to protocol. But the layovers had become something else entirely. It started innocently enough. A shared breakfast in Dubai, sitting at opposite ends of the crew table, but somehow engaged in the same conversation about the impossibility of sleeping in hotel rooms. A chance meeting in the Singapore hotel lobby, both of them restless at 3 a.m., jet-lagged and untethered, and the walk they took through the night city that lasted until dawn. They never planned these encounters. That would have been intentional, deliberate, a violation of the rules they both understood. But the coincidences mounted: the same gym at the same hour, the same coffee shop in London, the same observation deck in Tokyo. And with each accidental meeting, the wall between them eroded further. In London, during a rainy layover that trapped them in the hotel, they'd ended up in the lobby bar, nursing drinks neither of them wanted while the world outside turned gray and wet. The conversation had drifted from the superficial to the substantial: her family in Lagos, her father's death when she was 17, the pressure of being the eldest daughter with 3 siblings looking to her for support. His own family dynamics, the weight of expectations, his father's disappointment that Ji-hoon had chosen flying over joining the family's manufacturing business. My mother still introduces me as her son who could have been a CEO, Ji-hoon said, and there was a tiredness in his voice that Adanna recognized from her own life. My mother tells her friends I'm a pilot, Adanna replied, smiling without humor. She leaves out the part where I serve drinks and demonstrate oxygen masks. You speak 4 languages, Ji-hoon said, and Adanna looked up surprised. I heard you with the French passenger last flight. And the Arabic family. And you switched to Mandarin with the businessman in first class. You noticed that? I notice everything on my aircraft, he said, but the way he looked at her suggested he was talking about something more specific than general situational awareness. That night, walking her to her hotel room, they'd stood outside her door for too long, and Adanna had felt the pull of something inevitable and impossible. She'd seen it in his face too, the want, the conflict, the careful calculation of consequences. This is against the rules, she'd said quietly, not as a rejection but as a statement of fact. I know, Ji-hoon had replied, and she'd heard in those 2 words the entire architecture of his life, built on rules and discipline, and the fear of stepping outside the lines he'd drawn for himself. She'd gone into her room alone, and he'd returned to his own, and nothing had happened except everything had changed. The text messages started after London. Brief, careful, never crossing into anything that couldn't be explained as professional courtesy. Flight information, weather updates, a photo he'd sent of the northern lights from the cockpit during an Anchorage layover with the caption, "Thought you'd want to see this from up here." She'd responded with a photo of the sunrise over Lagos during her vacation, the city where she'd been born looking almost beautiful in the early light, and his response had been a single word, beautiful. She didn't know if he meant the city or something else, and the ambiguity felt both safe and dangerous. The other flight attendants had started to notice. She'd catch them watching when she entered the cockpit during service, seen the quick glances exchanged when she and Ji-hoon happened to be in the same briefing room. The gossip in airline crews was relentless and inevitable, and Adanna knew they were becoming a subject of speculation. "You're playing with fire, Chika," a fellow Nigerian flight attendant had warned her during a Lagos layover. "Korean captain, African attendant? They already watch us twice as hard. If anything happens, you know who gets blamed." Adanna had wanted to argue, to insist nothing was happening, but the lie had died in her throat. Something was happening, had been happening, was building toward something neither she nor Ji-hoon seemed capable of stopping. It was in Seoul, during a rare 48-hour layover, that everything changed. She'd been in her hotel room, staring at her phone, debating whether to send the message she'd typed and deleted 3 times, when her phone buzzed. Ji-hoon's name appeared on the screen. "Are you awake?" Her heart rate spiked. It was 11 p.m., and they'd landed 6 hours ago, and there was no professional reason for him to be contacting her. "Yes," she typed back. "Can I see you?" The question hung there on her screen, impossible to misinterpret. This wasn't about crew briefings or flight schedules. This was about the thing they'd been dancing around for 4 months, the connection they'd pretended was coincidental, the one they'd both been too disciplined to acknowledge. She should have said no. Should have reminded him of the rules, of the consequences, of the very real danger they'd both be in if anyone found out. Should have protected herself the way she'd learned to protect herself. Instead, she typed, "Room 1847. 20 minutes later, there was a knock on her door, and when she opened it, Ji-hoon stood there in civilian clothes, and the careful mask he always wore had cracked completely. "If you want me to leave," he said, "I'll leave. No questions, no awkwardness. We'll go back to the way things were." But they both knew things could never go back, had changed irrevocably the moment they'd acknowledged each other as more than captain and flight attendant, more than passing acquaintances sharing space in the sky. Adanna stepped back, opening the door wider, and Ji-hoon entered her room. They didn't touch immediately. Instead, they stood there, facing each other, and Adanna saw in his face the same fear and longing she felt in her own chest. "I can't stop thinking about you," Ji-hoon said, and the admission seemed to cost him everything. "I've tried. I know all the reasons this is impossible. I've listed them over and over. But I can't make myself care about any of them when I'm near you." "We'll lose our jobs," Adanna said, because someone had to speak the truth they were both avoiding. "I know. People are already talking. If they find out." "I know. Then why are you here?" Ji-hoon took a step closer, and Adanna felt her careful self-control beginning to fracture. "Because for the first time in my life, I'm tired of being safe," he said. "Because I've spent 9 years flying through the sky and never feeling like I was actually going anywhere until I met you. Because when I'm in the cockpit and you're in the cabin, the only thing I can think about is finding a reason to call you to the flight deck just to hear your voice." Adanna felt tears she hadn't known she was holding threatened to spill. "This is going to end badly," she whispered. "Probably," Ji-hoon agreed. "But I'm here anyway." She closed the distance between them, and when his hands came up to frame her face, when his lips met hers with a gentleness that felt like reverence, Adanna felt something she hadn't felt in years, the terrifying, exhilarating rush of allowing herself to want something without calculating the cost first. They made love slowly, carefully, as if they were both fragile things that might break under too much pressure. Ji-hoon touched her like she was a miracle he couldn't quite believe in, and Adanna let herself be vulnerable in a way she'd forgotten was possible. Afterward, lying in the hotel bed while Seoul's lights painted patterns across the ceiling, Ji-hoon traced the line of her collarbone with one finger and said, "We have to be careful." "I know," Adanna replied, reality already seeping back in. "No one can know. Not the other pilots, not the attendants. If the company finds out, they'll fire us both," Adanna finished. "But they'll destroy me first. I'm more expendable." Ji-hoon's hand stilled. "That's not. Yes, it is, Adanna said gently. You know it is. I'm a flight attendant from Africa. You're a Korean captain. We both know how this looks, who gets blamed, who gets believed. The silence that followed was heavy with truths neither of them wanted to acknowledge. I won't let them hurt you, Ji-hoon said finally, and Adanna wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that his care could protect her from the machinery of corporate politics and prejudice. But she'd spent her life learning that wanting something didn't make it real, and love, no matter how genuine, couldn't rewrite the rules of the world they lived in. Still, when Ji-hoon pulled her closer and she felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her back, Adanna let herself believe, just for tonight, that maybe they could be the exception to every rule that said they couldn't work. For 3 months, they lived in the spaces between rules. Their relationship existed in hotel rooms across 5 continents, in encrypted messages sent during layovers, in the careful choreography of appearing professionally distant while being emotionally intertwined. They learned each other's patterns, which flights Ji-hoon was assigned to, which routes Adanna bid for, how to make the scheduling system work in their favor without being obvious about it. In public, they were impeccable. During pre-flight briefings, Ji-hoon addressed her with the same courteous formality he used with every flight attendant. In the cockpit, when she brought meal services or passenger concerns, they maintained the professional script. On the aircraft, they never lingered, never allowed their eyes to meet for longer than necessary, never gave anyone a reason to suspect. But in Sydney, after a long-haul flight, they'd walked along the harbor at midnight, and Ji-hoon had held her hand in the darkness where no one from Pacific Wings could see. In Paris, they'd stolen 6 hours in a tiny apartment he'd rented under his name, away from the crew hotel, where they could touch and speak freely without fear. In Dubai, they'd sat on her hotel balcony until 4 a.m., talking about everything they couldn't say at 39,000 feet. What do you think happens when people find out? Adanna had asked him that night in Dubai, and Ji-hoon had been quiet for a long time before answering. I think they already suspect, he'd said finally. The other pilots. Some of them have been watching us. Adanna had felt the cold weight of fear settle in her stomach. What do they say? Nothing directly. But I can feel the judgment. First Officer Choi asked me last week if I was enjoying the international routes more these days. And Captain Han made a comment about being careful about inappropriate associations. They don't say these things to me, Adanna had said. They don't have to. I see it in how they look at me. Like I'm some kind of predator trying to seduce my way into an easier life. Ji-hoon had pulled her closer then, and she'd felt the anger in the tension of his body. That's not what this is. We know that. But what we know doesn't change what they believe. The prejudice came in small cuts at first. A chief purser who suddenly started scrutinizing Adanna's work with unusual intensity, noting minor infractions that had previously been overlooked. A shift in how some of the other Korean flight attendants interacted with her, the subtle freeze-out that happened when workplace social groups decided someone no longer belonged. Passengers who called her for service using the call button repeatedly, as if testing her patience, or who made comments about foreign staff while she stood right there. But it was the incident with the Japanese businessman in first class that made everything worse. Adanna had been working a Seoul to Los Angeles flight, serving the premium cabin with practiced grace despite the exhaustion that came from being awake for 20 hours straight due to scheduling changes. The passenger in 2A had been drinking heavily before the flight and had continued drinking throughout the service. When Adanna brought him his 4th whiskey, he grabbed her wrist and said something crude in slurred English about African women and what he wanted to do with her. She'd extracted herself professionally, reported the incident to the chief purser, and continued her service. It was not the first time she dealt with drunk passengers or racist comments, and the protocol was clear: de-escalate, report, document. But the passenger had filed a complaint. He claimed Adanna had been rude, had refused to serve him, had made him uncomfortable with her aggressive attitude. The fact that 3 other flight attendants had witnessed his harassment didn't matter. The fact that Adanna had followed every protocol correctly didn't matter. The company sided with the first-class passenger. Adanna was called into a meeting with the fleet supervisor 2 days later. She sat in the sterile conference room at Pacific Wing's headquarters, and the supervisor, a Korean man in his 50s who'd never made eye contact with her during their previous interactions, laid out the complaint as if it were established fact. "The passenger has flown with us for 15 years, the supervisor said. He's never filed a complaint before. We take his concerns seriously." "He grabbed my wrist," Adanna said, keeping her voice level. "He made sexually explicit comments. 3 other attendants witnessed it. It's all in my report. The other attendants say they didn't hear anything specific. And there were no marks on your wrist, so we can't verify physical contact. Because I removed myself before it escalated. That's what the training tells us to do." The supervisor looked down at his papers, and Adanna saw the decision had already been made. "We're putting a note in your file. And we're recommending you complete additional customer service training." "Customer service training," Adanna repeated, and she heard the bitterness in her own voice. "For being harassed by a drunk passenger. For the complaint filed against you, Ms. Okafor. I suggest you take this seriously. Pacific Wings has a reputation to maintain, and we expect our cabin crew to represent us professionally at all times." She'd wanted to scream. Wanted to walk out. Wanted to tell him exactly what she thought of a company that protected racist passengers over their own employees. But she had a family depending on her income, had rent to pay, had built 6 years of her life around this job. So she said, "Yes, sir," and left the conference room with the weight of injustice pressing down on her shoulders. Ji-hoon found out that evening. She texted him the bare facts: complaint filed, note in file, training required, and he'd shown up at her apartment in Seoul without asking, without waiting for permission. "This is wrong," he'd said the moment she opened the door, and she'd seen the fury in his face. "I'm going to file a statement. I'll corroborate your report. You weren't on that flight." "I don't care. I know you. I know you wouldn't." Ji-hoon. She'd stopped him with a hand on his chest. "If you file a statement defending me, they'll know about us. And then both of our careers are over. Your career is already being destroyed by their inaction. A note in my file isn't a termination. If they find out about us, I'll be fired immediately. We both will." He'd paced her small living room, and she'd watched him wrestle with the impossibility of protecting her without exposing them both. Finally, he'd stopped and looked at her with such helplessness that her heart had broken for him. "I hate this," he'd said quietly. "I hate that I can't defend you. I hate that they can do this to you and I have to stay silent." "Welcome to my life," Adanna had replied, not unkindly. "This is what it's like to be expendable." That night, they'd held each other in her bed, and she'd felt the shift in their relationship, the intrusion of the outside world into the private space they'd built, the reminder that love wasn't enough to protect them from systems designed to keep them apart. But it was Captain Han who finally forced everything into the open. Ji-hoon had been flying with him more frequently, a scheduling coincidence that felt less and less coincidental as the weeks progressed. Han was 53, a senior captain with 25 years at Pacific Wings, and he'd taken it upon himself to mentor younger pilots, which mostly meant enforcing his particular vision of how captains should behave. During a Seoul to San Francisco layover, Han had invited Ji-hoon to dinner with several other Korean pilots. It was framed as professional networking, the kind of mandatory socializing that was expected within the airline's hierarchy. Ji-hoon couldn't refuse without raising suspicion. They'd gone to a Korean restaurant near the hotel, and over soju and grilled meat, the conversation had eventually turned to the topic Han had clearly been steering toward all evening. "I hear you've been flying with the African girl a lot," Han had said, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "The tall one. Okafor." Ji-hoon had kept his expression neutral. "The scheduling system assigns crew randomly." "Nothing is random at Pacific Wings," another pilot had interjected. "If you're flying together often, someone upstairs is either testing you or setting you up." "Setting me up for what?" Han had poured more soju, let the silence stretch. "There are rumors," he'd said finally, "about inappropriate relationships between flight deck and cabin crew. The company is watching certain people very carefully." "I'm not aware of any inappropriate relationships on my flights," Ji-hoon had said, and he'd marveled at how steady his voice sounded while his heart hammered against his ribs. "Good," Han had replied. Because they destroy careers. Both careers. And for what? A flight attendant. He'd shaken his head. Korean men who pursue these women, they embarrass themselves and their families. And the women? They're usually just looking for a way up, if you know what I mean. Ji-hoon had felt rage flood his body, had wanted to defend Adanna, to challenge every racist assumption in Han's statement. But he'd sat there, silent, complicit by his inaction, and hated himself for it. I appreciate the advice, he'd managed to say, and the other pilots had nodded approvingly, as if they'd successfully mentored him away from some career-ending mistake. That night, lying in his hotel room, Ji-hoon had stared at the ceiling and faced the truth he'd been avoiding. Their relationship couldn't remain secret forever, and when it was discovered, Adanna would pay the highest price. His family connections, his status as a Korean captain, his years of perfect performance reviews, these things might protect him, might earn him a suspension rather than a termination, a transfer rather than dismissal. Adanna had none of those protections. She was an outsider in a company that tolerated her presence, but didn't value it, working a job where she could be replaced with a single signature on a termination form. And he loved her enough that her survival mattered more than his happiness. He texted her at 2 a.m., "We need to talk." They'd met in the hotel gym again, the same place where this had all started, and Ji-hoon had tried to find the words to protect her from himself. "They're watching us," he'd said. "The senior captains. They know something is happening, even if they can't prove it yet." Adanna had stopped her run, turned to face him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we need to be more careful." "Or we need to," he'd faltered, unable to say the words. And this, Adanna had finished for him, and he'd heard no surprise in her voice, only a weary resignation. "I don't want to. But I can't watch them destroy you because of me. You think ending it will protect me?" Adanna had laughed without humor. "Ji-hoon, they've already decided what I am. Whether we're together or not doesn't change their assumptions. At least if we're together, I have something worth the risk." "Adanna, I'm not naive," she'd interrupted. "I know how this ends. I've known from the beginning. But I chose you anyway, chose this, because for 3 months I got to feel like I mattered to someone beyond what I could do for them." Ji-hoon had felt something break in his chest. "You matter to me more than anything. Then don't leave me because you're afraid of what might happen. Stay until something actually does. Let me choose my own risks." So he'd stayed. They'd continued their impossible relationship, knowing they were flying toward a storm they couldn't avoid, unable to change course because the alternative was letting go of the only real thing either of them had found in years of searching. The end came in October, on a Los Angeles to Seoul flight that should have been routine. They'd been careful, so careful. No messages except about flight operations. No lingering looks during briefings. No physical contact anywhere near the airline's cameras or other crew members. They'd followed every protocol, maintained every professional boundary in public. But someone had been watching more closely than they'd known. During the flight, Ji-hoon had called Adanna to the cockpit for a legitimate operational reason, a passenger in business class who was demanding to speak with the captain about an alleged service failure. Adanna had entered the cockpit with the chief purser, explained the situation with her usual professionalism, and Ji-hoon had provided the standard diplomatic response to passenger complaints. The entire interaction lasted 4 minutes and was completely appropriate. But the chief purser, a woman named Park Soo-jin who'd always treated Adanna with cool disdain, had noticed something. Perhaps it was the way Ji-hoon's voice softened fractionally when addressing Adanna. Perhaps it was a glance that lasted a half-second too long. Perhaps it was simply the confirmation of suspicions she'd already been nursing. Whatever it was, Soo-jin filed a report to the fleet supervisor the moment they landed in Seoul. She claimed there was an inappropriate familiarity between Captain Park and flight attendant Okafor, that their interaction in the cockpit had been unprofessional in tone, and that she had concerns about the integrity of the flight deck operations given the personal nature of their relationship. The report was vague enough to avoid accusations of actual wrongdoing, but specific enough to trigger an investigation. And once Pacific Wings opened an investigation, everything hidden would eventually surface. They were both called in separately 3 days later. Ji-hoon first, to the same conference room where Adanna had been reprimanded about the first-class passenger incident. The fleet supervisor was there, along with a representative from Human Resources and a lawyer from the company's legal department. "We've received reports of an inappropriate relationship between you and Flight Attendant Okafor," the HR representative had stated without preamble. Company policy strictly forbids romantic relationships between flight deck and cabin crew. "Are you aware of this policy?" "Yes," Ji-hoon had said, his mind racing through possible responses, calculating damage control. "Are you currently engaged in a romantic relationship with Flight Attendant Okafor?" This was the moment. Ji-hoon could lie, could deny everything, and they'd have to prove it. But lying would mean throwing Adanna to the wolves, would mean letting her take the full blame while he hid behind his privilege. "Yes," he'd said, and watched the lawyers exchange satisfied glances. "How long has this relationship been ongoing?" 3 months. "And you were aware this violated company policy?" "Yes." The HR representative had closed her folder. "You're being placed on immediate suspension pending the completion of our investigation. You will not fly any scheduled routes, and you will not contact Flight Attendant Okafor during this period. We'll be interviewing other crew members and reviewing flight records. Depending on what we find, the outcome could range from reassignment to termination." Ji-hoon had nodded, accepting the consequences of his honesty. "I'd like to make clear that I initiated this relationship. Flight Attendant Okafor is not responsible for. We'll determine responsibility during the investigation." The lawyer had cut him off. "You're dismissed, Captain Park." Adanna's interview had come 2 hours later. They'd asked her the same questions, and she'd given the same honest answers, and she'd watched their faces confirm what she'd always known. She was already convicted before the investigation even began. "You understand that as a flight attendant, you have a responsibility to maintain professional boundaries," the HR representative had said, and Adanna had heard the unspoken accusation, "You seduced a captain for personal gain." "I understand that 2 adults entered into a consensual relationship," Adanna had replied, refusing to accept the narrative they were building. "A relationship that violated company policy and potentially compromised flight safety. Our relationship never affected our professional duties. Captain Park's performance has been exemplary. Mine has been as well, as my reviews confirm." "That's not for you to determine," the fleet supervisor had interjected. "You're suspended, effective immediately. We'll be reviewing every flight you've worked together, looking for any instances where this relationship may have affected operational decisions or crew dynamics." "You won't find any," Adanna had said. "We'll see," the HR representative had replied, and Adanna had known then that the decision was already made. They'd find something or they'd manufacture something, because the system needed someone to blame, and she was the easiest target. She'd left the headquarters building and found Ji-hoon waiting outside, despite the instruction not to contact each other. He looked as devastated as she felt, and when their eyes met, she saw the same understanding reflected there. This was the beginning of the end. "I told them it was my fault," Ji-hoon said. "I made sure they knew I initiated everything." "They don't care who initiated it," Adanna replied. "To them, I'm the foreign flight attendant who seduced a captain. That's the story that fits their worldview. I won't let them do this to you. You can't stop them." She'd said it gently, without accusation. "Your family has money, connections. Your father can make calls, can advocate for you. I have none of that. We both know how this ends." Ji-hoon had taken her hand right there in public, no longer caring who saw. "Then we fight it together. We hire lawyers. We go to the press if we have to." Adanna had wanted to believe him, wanted to think that their love was powerful enough to overcome systemic prejudice and corporate power. But she'd spent her life learning that the world didn't reward noble stands, and fighting usually just meant losing more slowly. "Okay," she'd said anyway, because she loved him and because surrendering without fighting felt like dying. "We fight." The investigation took 6 weeks, and every day of it felt like slow drowning. Pacific Wings interviewed 37 crew members, pulled records from every flight Ji-hoon and Adanna had worked together, reviewed security footage from airports and hotels across 3 continents. They were looking for evidence of professional misconduct, proof that their relationship had compromised safety, that they'd shown favoritism, that the integrity of flight operations had been damaged. They found nothing. Because there was nothing to find. Ji-hoon and Adanna had been meticulous about maintaining professional boundaries in their work. Every decision Ji-hoon had made in the cockpit had been by protocol. Every service Adanna had performed had been to standard. Their personal relationship had existed in the margins of their professional lives, never bleeding into the work itself. But the investigation wasn't really about finding evidence. It was about creating a narrative that would justify the decision Pacific Wings had already made. Ji-hoon hired a lawyer, a sharp woman in her 40s who specialized in employment law. She'd reviewed the case and been blunt in her assessment. They're going to fire both of you. The relationship violated policy, and that gives them legal grounds. The question is whether we can negotiate a settlement that protects your future employment prospects. I don't care about settlement, Ji-hoon had said. I want to fight this. Fight what? You violated a clear policy that you signed when you were hired. They have grounds for termination with cause, which means no severance, no references, and potential blacklisting from other airlines. The policy is unjust. Other airlines don't have such strict rules about crew relationships. Other airlines aren't based in Korea with a heavily hierarchical culture. Pacific Wings can set whatever employment policies they want, as long as they're applied consistently. The lawyer had paused. And that's the problem. They haven't applied this consistently. There are at least 3 other known relationships between pilots and flight attendants that haven't been investigated or punished. Then we use that, Ji-hoon had insisted. We show the discrimination. We can try. But you need to understand, the other relationships are between Korean pilots and Korean flight attendants. The optics of your case are different, and the company knows it. They can paint this as a cautionary tale about professional boundaries without addressing their own inconsistent enforcement. Because Adanna is African, Ji-hoon had said, finally naming the truth they'd all been dancing around. Because you're a Korean captain, and she's an African flight attendant, and that combination triggers every prejudice and assumption Pacific Wings wants to avoid being associated with. They'll fire you both, but her reputation will be destroyed while yours will be a good man who made a mistake. Ji-hoon had felt sick. How do we protect her? We can't. Not fully. But we can try to negotiate a clean termination, severance, neutral reference, agreement not to pursue wrongful termination claims. It's the best outcome you'll get. That's not good enough. It's what the system allows, the lawyer had replied. You can fight it, spend 2 years in litigation, drain your savings, and probably still lose. Or you can take the settlement and move on with your lives. Adanna had her own legal consultation, paid for with borrowed money because Ji-hoon had insisted on covering the cost and she'd been too proud to accept. Her lawyer had been less diplomatic in his assessment. They're going to destroy you, he'd said. Not officially, not in any way you can sue over. But your career in aviation is finished. The story will follow you, the flight attendant who slept with a captain, who violated professional boundaries, who couldn't be trusted. No other airline will hire you, not for international routes. Maybe domestic, maybe some smaller carrier, but Pacific Wings was your ceiling, and they're going to make sure everyone knows why you fell. Because I fell in love, Adanna had said, and even to her own ears it sounded naive. Because you fell in love with someone you weren't supposed to love, in a profession that doesn't forgive that kind of mistake. He'd looked at her with something like pity. I can try to negotiate a settlement. But I want you to understand, this is going to cost you more than the job. Your reputation, your career trajectory, possibly your ability to stay in Korea. Are you prepared for that? She hadn't been. How could anyone be prepared for the complete dismantling of the life they'd built? But she nodded anyway, because what other choice did she have? The final decision came down on a Tuesday afternoon. Ji-hoon and Adanna were summoned separately to receive their verdicts, though by then they both knew what was coming. Ji-hoon's meeting lasted 15 minutes. The HR representative read from a prepared statement, based on our investigation, we have determined that you violated Section 7C of Pacific Wings employment policy regarding fraternization between flight deck and cabin crew. While we found no evidence that this relationship compromised flight safety or operational standards, the violation of policy is sufficient grounds for termination. However, in recognition of your 9 years of exemplary service, We are offering you the option to resign in lieu of termination. If you accept this option by end of day tomorrow, you will receive 3 months severance and a neutral letter of reference. And if I don't accept? Ji-hoon had asked. Then you will be terminated for cause, with no severance and no reference. The termination will be noted in your employment record, which will be available to any airline that requests your work history. It was a trap disguised as mercy. Accept the resignation and admit guilt, or fight and lose everything. Ji-hoon thought about the lawyer's advice, thought about Adanna and what outcome would protect her most, and made his choice. I'll accept the resignation, he'd said. But I want the same terms offered to flight attendant Okafor. We don't discuss other employees' cases. Then I don't accept. The HR representative had exchanged glances with the fleet supervisor. Captain Park, we're offering you a reasonable resolution. What happens with flight attendant Okafor is separate. No, Ji-hoon had said. It's not. If she doesn't get the same terms, resignation, severance, neutral reference, then I reject your offer and we go to litigation. And I'll make sure every reporter in Seoul knows that Pacific Wings fired an African woman for a relationship while letting Korean pilots keep their jobs for the same thing. It was a bluff, mostly. Ji-hoon didn't have proof of the other relationships, just rumors and speculation. But Pacific Wings didn't know that, and the threat of racial discrimination claims was enough to make them hesitate. We'll take your request under consideration, the HR representative had finally said. Adanna's meeting happened 3 hours later, and the offer they extended to her was identical to Ji-hoon's: resign by end of day tomorrow, receive 3 months severance and a neutral reference. She'd known immediately that Ji-hoon had fought for this, had used whatever leverage he had to protect her, and the knowledge made her love him more even as she mourned what that love had cost them both. She'd accepted the resignation without negotiating. There was nothing to negotiate for, no future at Pacific Wings to salvage. She signed the paperwork, collected her final paycheck, and walked out of the headquarters building knowing she'd never wear the uniform again. They met that night at Adanna's apartment, both of them unemployed and officially disgraced, and held each other while the weight of their losses settled over them like a shroud. I'm sorry, Ji-hoon said, and he'd said it so many times over the past 6 weeks that the words had started to lose meaning. Stop apologizing, Adanna replied. We made choices. We knew the risks. I should have protected you better. You did protect me. You got me the same terms you got. Without you, they would have just fired me outright. 3 months severance, Ji-hoon said bitterly. That's what 6 years of service is worth to them. That's what your life is worth. Adanna pulled back to look at him. We're both unemployed now. We're both blacklisted from the industry we spent years building careers in. We can be angry about it, or we can figure out what comes next. What has come next? Ji-hoon asked, and she heard the fear in his voice. The man who'd built his identity around being a pilot suddenly unmoored from the only thing that defined him. I don't know, Adanna admitted. But we figure it out together. The next 6 months were the hardest of Ji-hoon's life. His father had been furious when he learned about the termination, less about the loss of the job than about the shame it brought to the family name. His mother had cried and asked him over and over why he'd thrown away his career for that girl, as if Adanna was some temporary infatuation rather than the person he loved. His brother had suggested he move back home, take a position at the family company, start over properly. Ji-hoon had refused all of it. He'd rented a small apartment in a less expensive part of Seoul, started sending out resumes to other airlines, and tried to build something from the wreckage of his professional life. But the lawyer had been right, the story followed him. Airlines in Korea wouldn't touch him, too worried about the controversy. International airlines conducted background checks and saw the resignation in lieu of termination, read between the lines, and found other candidates. His savings dwindled. The severance lasted 3 months, as promised, and then he was living on credit cards and the diminishing remains of what he'd set aside over 9 years of flying. He took a job teaching English at a private academy, work that paid a fraction of what he'd earned as a captain and made him feel like he was performing a parody of a life rather than living one. Adanna's situation was worse. She'd tried to find flight attendant positions with other airlines, But the Whisper network in aviation was efficient and merciless. Pacific Wings hadn't blacklisted her officially, but they didn't need to. The story of her termination had spread through airline crew communities, exaggerated, distorted, turned into a cautionary tale about African women who seduced pilots for status. She'd applied for hotel work, customer service positions, anything that would use her language skills and hospitality experience. But in Korea, being a foreigner without active visa sponsorship from an employer made her nearly unemployable. Her visa was contingent on her Pacific Wings employment, and now that was gone. She had 60 days to find new sponsorship or leave the country. She'd moved in with Ji-hoon not out of romance, but out of necessity. Her lease was ending, she couldn't afford rent on her own, and every day she spent in Korea without a job brought her closer to deportation. They lived in his small apartment, two people who'd loved each other in secret now forced to face each other's despair in close quarters. The worst part was the judgment from others. Ji-hoon's friends from the airline stopped returning his calls, as if failure was contagious. Adanna's fellow Nigerian flight attendants, who'd warned her about exactly this outcome, offered sympathy but no practical help. The world they'd existed in had rules, and they'd broken them, and now they were learning what it meant to be cast out. They fought sometimes, small arguments about money and housework that were really about the larger impossibility of their situation. Ji-hoon felt the weight of his family's disappointment and his own diminished circumstances pressing on him constantly. Adanna felt the cultural isolation of being a black woman in Korea with no professional identity and no community to anchor to. They took turns being strong for each other, but there were days when both of them were drowning and neither could pull the other to safety. It was during one of those dark days, when Adanna had received yet another job rejection and Ji-hoon had taught another mind-numbing English class to teenagers who barely tolerated his presence, that they'd had the conversation that would change everything. "I have to leave Korea," Adanna had said. They were sitting on the floor of the apartment eating instant noodles because it was all they could afford. "My visa expires in 3 weeks. I've applied for every position I can find, and no one will sponsor me." "We'll figure something out," Ji-hoon had said, but they both knew it was empty reassurance. "There's nothing to figure out. I go back to Lagos, you stay here, and we, what? Maintain a long-distance relationship while we're both unemployed and bitter." "I could come with you," Ji-hoon had offered, and he'd meant it even though the idea terrified him. "We could start over somewhere new." "And do what?" "Nigeria doesn't need Korean pilots any more than Korea needs Nigerian flight attendants. We'd just be broke and struggling in a different country." The silence that followed was heavy with the truth neither of them wanted to name. Maybe love wasn't enough. Maybe they'd sacrificed everything for a relationship that couldn't survive the reality of unemployment, visa restrictions, and the grinding poverty of starting over with nothing. "There has to be something we can do," Ji-hoon had said. "Some kind of work we could both do that doesn't require aviation experience or visa sponsorship." "Like what?" "We're trained for one thing, and that industry doesn't want us anymore." Ji-hoon had stared at the bare walls of the apartment, thinking about all the things he'd once been good at. Flying required precision, attention to detail, the ability to follow protocols and maintain standards under pressure. Those skills had to translate to something. "What if we started our own business?" he'd said suddenly. Adanna had looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "With what capital?" "We can barely afford food. Something that doesn't require much startup cost. Service industry, maybe." "Cleaning." "Cleaning," Adanna had repeated flatly. "Think about it. We both know what clean means. We worked in an industry where standards were everything. We have attention to detail. We're used to early mornings and long hours. And cleaning doesn't require special visas or credentials. It also doesn't pay anything. And it's..." She'd trailed off, and Ji-hoon had seen her wrestling with the same pride he was feeling. "Humiliating," he'd finished. "Less prestigious than what we used to do?" "Yes. But it's work we could do together. That doesn't depend on anyone else hiring us or approving of us." Adanna had been quiet for a long time, turning the idea over in her mind. "We'd be starting from nothing. Cleaning houses, maybe offices if we can get contracts. It would be brutal work." "More brutal than this?" Ji-hoon had gestured at their cramped apartment, at the life they were barely surviving. At least this is temporary suffering. If we start a cleaning business, we're choosing to be cleaners. That becomes our identity. Then it becomes our identity, Ji-hoon had said. I'd rather be a cleaner working beside you than a failed pilot without you. The words had hung between them, and Adanna had felt something shift, a small spark of possibility in the overwhelming darkness of their situation. Okay, she'd said finally. Let's be cleaners. They'd started with nothing but determination and 15 years of combined experience knowing what clean actually meant. Ji-hoon used his remaining credit to buy basic cleaning supplies, industrial-grade products that reminded him of the chemicals used to maintain aircraft interiors. Adanna designed flyers on a free design website, and they spent their weekends distributing them in apartment buildings and small office complexes. The first month, they got 3 clients, a small apartment, a startup office, and a restaurant kitchen. The work was exactly as brutal as they'd anticipated. Ji-hoon's back ached from scrubbing floors on his hands and knees. Adanna's hands cracked and bled from the cleaning chemicals despite wearing gloves. They worked 12-hour days and made barely enough to cover rent and food. But they were working together, building something that was theirs, and for the first time since their termination, they felt like they had agency over their own lives. The breakthrough came 3 months in. One of their clients, the startup office, had been impressed with their work and recommended them to a larger tech company looking for reliable after-hours cleaning. Ji-hoon had put on his best suit, the one he'd worn for job interviews, and Adanna had joined him for the pitch meeting. The facility manager had looked skeptical when they'd walked in, a Korean man in a worn suit and a tall African woman, presenting themselves as a cleaning service. But when they detailed their quality standards, their understanding of contamination protocols, their commitment to consistency, something had shifted in his expression. You both worked for Pacific Wings? He'd asked, having seen it on the simple business cards they'd printed. Yes, Ji-hoon had answered, waiting for the judgment, the recognition of their disgrace. Instead, the manager had nodded thoughtfully. Airlines have the highest cleanliness standards in the industry. If you maintain those standards there, you can maintain them here. You're hired. That contract had changed everything. The tech company paid 3 times what they'd been making from residential clients, and the work was consistent 5 days a week, for hours per night. It wasn't enough to live comfortably, but it was enough to stop drowning. More importantly, it proved the model worked. They used the tech company as a reference to pitch other corporate clients. Slowly, painfully, they built a client base. They hired their first employee, a Korean woman in her 50s who needed evening work to supplement her retirement income. Then another employee. Then 3 more. By the end of the first year, they had 15 employees and contracts with 12 corporate clients. Ji-hoon handled operations and client relations, using the same systematic approach he'd used for flight planning. Adanna managed staff and quality control, applying the same attention to detail she'd learned in cabin service. They weren't making pilot salaries, but they were surviving, and the business was growing. They'd named it Sky Clean Services, a small tribute to what they'd lost and what they'd built from those ashes. The logo Adanna designed showed a simple skyline, clean and geometric, nothing referencing their past directly, but carrying the memory of it nonetheless. Year 2 was when things accelerated. They landed a major contract with Incheon Airport, the same airport where Ji-hoon had flown out of for 9 years, where Adanna had worked hundreds of flights. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They were back at the airport, but this time scrubbing floors instead of flying planes or serving passengers. But the airport contract led to more airline-adjacent businesses, cargo companies, airline catering services, aircraft maintenance facilities. Their aviation experience became an asset rather than a liability. They understood the standards these companies needed, spoke their language, knew what clean meant in an industry where safety depended on it. By year 3, Sky Clean Services employed 40 people and generated revenue that exceeded what both Ji-hoon and Adanna had earned combined at Pacific Wings. They moved out of the small apartment into a modest house. They bought a used van for the business, then 2 more. They incorporated properly, hired an accountant, started paying themselves actual salaries. And somewhere in the grinding work of building something from nothing, their relationship had been tested and tempered into something stronger than the romantic ideal they'd started with. They'd seen each other at their worst, broke, angry, scared, exhausted. They'd fought over money and strategy, and whose turn it was to handle the midnight emergency when a client called about a problem. They'd held each other through panic attacks and despair and the slow erosion of identity that came with their fall from professional grace. But they'd survived. Together. And the love that remained was built on something more solid than attraction or loneliness. It was built on choosing each other, day after day, even when it would have been easier to walk away. Year 4 was when everything changed again. They'd expanded into luxury residential cleaning, targeting high-rise apartment buildings in Seoul's wealthiest districts. The margins were better, the clients were demanding, but paid premium rates, and word of mouth in those circles was powerful. One of their clients was a real estate developer who'd been impressed with their work cleaning his personal residence. He'd invited Ji-hoon to bid on a major project, cleaning and maintaining a new luxury, high-rise complex with 200 units. The contract was worth more than everything they'd done in the previous 3 years combined. "We're not big enough to handle this," Adanna had said when Ji-hoon told her about the opportunity. "We'd need to hire 30 more people, buy more equipment, possibly take out a loan to cover startup costs before the payments begin." "It's a risk," Ji-hoon had agreed. "But it's also the opportunity that could take us to the next level. Or bankrupt us if we fail." They'd stayed up all night running numbers, arguing through scenarios, weighing the risk against the potential reward. Finally, as dawn broke over Seoul, they'd made the decision together. They'd take the contract. The next 6 months were chaos. They hired and trained new staff. They bought equipment on credit. They implemented new systems and protocols to handle the scale. There were failures and near disasters, a new employee who damaged expensive marble floors, a scheduling system that collapsed during the first week, clients who were never satisfied no matter how many times their residences were cleaned. But they'd learned in aviation that systems succeed when protocols are followed and teams work together. They applied those lessons, adjusted and improved, and gradually the operation stabilized. The luxury high-rise contract became their flagship client, leading to 3 more similar buildings, then 5, then 10. By the end of year 5, Sky Clean Services employed 120 people and had annual revenue in the millions. They'd gone from scrubbing floors themselves to managing a company that required full-time attention from both of them. They hired a COO, brought in professional management, moved into actual office space instead of running operations from their dining room table. And, through it all, Pacific Wings had continued flying their routes, the airline that had destroyed 2 careers over a forbidden relationship, never knowing that the people they'd discarded had built something more valuable than anything they'd lost. The first time they saw someone from their past life, it was a Tuesday afternoon in year 6. Ji-hoon was meeting a potential client at a high-end hotel in Gangnam, wearing the expensive suit that success had allowed him to buy, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd built something real. He was waiting in the lobby when he saw Captain Han walk past, still in his Pacific Wings uniform, dragging a roller bag toward the hotel restaurant. Their eyes met, and Ji-hoon saw the flicker of recognition followed by something that might have been embarrassment. Han nodded once, a stiff acknowledgement, and kept walking. He didn't stop to speak, didn't ask how Ji-hoon was doing, didn't acknowledge the elephant of history between them. Ji-hoon stood there watching Han disappear into the restaurant, and he felt nothing. No anger, no vindication, not even the satisfaction he'd once imagined he'd feel seeing someone from Pacific Wings after proving he could survive without them. Just a distant recognition that this man, who'd once tried to warn him away from Adanna with racist assumptions and career threats, was now irrelevant to his life. "Was that someone you knew?" his client asked, approaching from the elevator bank. "Someone I used to work with," Ji-hoon replied. "A long time ago." They closed the deal that afternoon, another luxury property, another step in Sky Clean's expansion. And Ji-hoon never thought about Captain Han again. Adanna's encounter came differently. She was at Incheon Airport for a routine quality check on their cleaning operations there when she saw a familiar face across the terminal, Chika, the Nigerian flight attendant who'd warned her about the dangers of her relationship with Ji-hoon all those years ago. Chika was in uniform, pulling a roller bag, looking tired in the way all flight attendants looked tired. Their eyes met, and Chika's widened in recognition. She changed direction, walking toward Adanna with an expression that was hard to read. "Adanna," Chika said. "I heard you were still in Korea. After everything, I thought you'd gone back to Lagos." "I stayed," Adanna replied simply. Chika looked at her clothes, professional but not luxury, the clothes of someone who worked hard but had money now. "What are you doing here?" "At the airport. I own a cleaning company. We have the contract for several terminals." "You own?" Chika's expression shifted through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been respect. "A cleaning company. You went from flight attendant to cleaning." "I went from unemployed and disgraced to business owner," Adanna corrected gently. "The cleaning was just the path." "And Captain Park? Are you two still?" "We're married," Adanna said, and even after 3 years of marriage, saying it still felt like claiming something the world had tried to deny them. "The business is both of ours. We built it together." Chika was quiet for a moment, and Adanna could see her reassessing, recalculating the tragedy she'd thought she knew. "I'm sorry," Chika said finally, "for how I reacted back then. I thought I was protecting you, but really I was just scared. Scared of standing out, of breaking the rules, of being noticed for anything except perfect service." "I know," Adanna said, because she did. She'd been that scared too, had spent years making herself smaller, and she couldn't judge Chika for the same survival instinct. "How are things at Pacific Wings?" "The same," Chika replied with a tired smile. "Still flying. Still serving. Still waiting for something to change that never does." She paused. "I heard they fired the chief purser who reported you. Park Soo-jin. She was found stealing from duty-free sales. They investigated her after someone tipped them off about irregular inventory." Adanna felt a flicker of satisfaction, but it died quickly. Soo-jin's downfall didn't undo the damage she'd caused, didn't restore what had been taken. "Karma is slow," Adanna said. "But I guess it arrives eventually." "You seem happy," Chika observed. "Genuinely happy. I don't see that often anymore, in our circles." "I am," Adanna said, and realized it was true. Not the happiness of an easy life or a life without scars, but the deeper contentment of having survived something that was meant to destroy her and coming out the other side with her dignity intact. "It took a long time to get here. And it wasn't the life I planned. But it's mine, and I fought for it, and that matters." Chika nodded, and Adanna saw in her face the wistfulness of someone who'd played it safe and was wondering if safety had been worth the cost. "I should get to my gate," Chika said. "But I'm glad I saw you. Glad you're okay. More than okay." "Fly safe," Adanna said, and watched Chika walk toward the gates, back to the life Adanna had once thought was her ceiling and now recognized as just one room in a much larger house. By year 7, Sky Clean Services had become one of the top 3 commercial cleaning companies in Seoul. They'd expanded beyond just cleaning into facility management, security coordination, and hospitality consulting. Their client list included 4 5-star hotels, 20 luxury residential complexes, the airport, 3 universities, and a growing portfolio of corporate headquarters. They employed 300 people now, many of them immigrants like Adanna had been, people who needed work that didn't judge them for their accent or their passport. Ji-hoon had insisted on fair wages, benefits, and opportunities for advancement. Several of their supervisors had started as cleaners and worked their way into management roles. "We're not just building a business," Ji-hoon had said when they'd hired their first HR director. "We're building the company we wish had employed us. The place that sees people as valuable regardless of where they're from or what mistakes they've made." The media had eventually found their story, the Korean pilot and Nigerian flight attendant who'd been fired for falling in love and had turned their disgrace into a multi-million-dollar business. A financial magazine ran a profile titled "Love and Grit: How a Forbidden Romance Built an Empire," and suddenly they were being invited to speak at business schools and entrepreneurship conferences. Adanna had been reluctant to participate at first. "I don't want to be the poster child for overcoming adversity," she'd said. "It feels like performing our pain for other people's inspiration." Then don't perform it, Ji-hoon had replied. Tell the truth. Tell them it was brutal and unfair, and we didn't overcome it through positive thinking or determination alone. Tell them we survived because we were too stubborn to die quietly. So she did. At the conferences and the interviews, Adanna spoke honestly about the racism she'd faced, the systems designed to protect some people while discarding others, the reality that success hadn't erased the scars of what they'd endured. And people listened, especially the young women who looked like her, who saw themselves in her story and needed to know that surviving was possible. Ji-hoon spoke about privilege and how he'd had to learn to use his for something more than protecting himself. About the assumptions he'd carried about hierarchy and worth, and how loving Adanna had forced him to examine beliefs he'd never questioned. About the male ego and how building something alongside a partner meant surrendering the need to be the hero or the provider or the one in control. Their story became complicated and human rather than a simple redemption narrative, and that's when it started to matter to people beyond the business community. Articles were written, a documentary filmmaker reached out, and someone even optioned their story for a potential film, though nothing came of it. But through all the attention, Ji-hoon and Adanna kept their focus on the work itself. They expanded into other cities: Busan, Incheon, Daegu. They developed proprietary cleaning protocols and training systems. They innovated in an industry that had been doing things the same way for decades. And every day, they woke up in the house they'd bought together, drove to the office they'd built together, and ran the company they'd created from nothing but necessity and love. The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning in Year 8. It was addressed to Captain Park Ji-hoon and Ms. Adanna Okafor Park, and it came from Pacific Wings International. The company was hosting a 50th anniversary gala celebrating 5 decades of aviation excellence, and they were inviting notable alumni to attend. Adanna had found the invitation on Ji-hoon's desk and brought it to him with an expression somewhere between disbelief and dark humor. "They have the audacity," she said, handing it to him. Ji-hoon read it and laughed, a genuine sound of surprise. "Do they not know? Or do they not care?" "I think someone in their marketing department pulled a list of former employees with notable current success," Adanna said. "And we qualified without anyone bothering to check why we're former employees. We should decline." Obviously. They stood there looking at the invitation, at the Pacific Wings logo that had once meant everything to both of them, and Ji-hoon felt Adanna's hand find his. "Or," she said slowly, "we could go." "Why would we do that?" "Because we can," Adanna replied. "Because we're not the desperate, destroyed people they discarded anymore. Because walking into that room as business owners, as equals, might be the closure we didn't know we needed." Ji-hoon considered it. The idea of returning to Pacific Wings headquarters, of facing the people who judged them and found them unworthy, stirred something in him. Not anger anymore, not the burning need for revenge he'd once carried, but a quiet desire to bear witness to his own survival, to close a circle that had been left open. "Okay," he said. "Let's go." The gala was held in a luxury hotel ballroom in downtown Seoul, decorated in Pacific Wings corporate colors with photos from 5 decades of aviation history covering the walls. Current and former employees mingled in formal wear, trading stories about memorable flights and career milestones. The CEO gave a speech about legacy and excellence. The chief pilots were honored for their years of service. Ji-hoon and Adanna arrived together, her in an elegant dress that made heads turn, him in a tailored suit that spoke of success. They debated whether to enter separately to avoid drawing attention, but ultimately decided that pretending they weren't together would be a betrayal of everything they'd fought for. The reaction when they walked in was immediate. Conversations paused. Former colleagues stared. Someone whispered to someone else, and the whisper rippled through the room like a wave. But Ji-hoon and Adanna held their heads high and moved into the space as if they belonged there, because they did. They'd earned their success through the same determination and skill that had made them good at flying and cabin service. They weren't crashing the party or seeking attention. They were simply 2 people who'd been invited to celebrate an airline they'd once served. First Officer Choi was the first to approach them. He was a captain now, Ji-hoon noticed, wearing the 4 stripes with visible pride. "Captain Park," Choi said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. I heard you'd done well. Built a successful business. I'm happy for you. Thank you, Ji-hoon replied. Congratulations on making captain. It took longer than it should have, Choi said. They made us all take additional training after the investigation. Company wanted to show they were serious about professional standards. He glanced at Adanna. I'm sorry for how things went. I never thought they'd terminate you both over a relationship. It seemed excessive. It was excessive, Adanna said simply. But we survived it. Other former colleagues approached throughout the evening, and the interactions varied. Some were genuinely happy to see them, curious about their business success. Others were cold, judgmental, still viewing them as cautionary tales about crossing professional boundaries. A few Korean pilots made pointed comments about those who couldn't make it in aviation having to settle for service industry work, the contempt for cleaning barely disguised. Ji-hoon let those comments wash over him without response. There was no point in defending himself to people who'd already decided his worth. And besides, his bank account and his company's growth metrics spoke louder than any argument he could make. It was the fleet supervisor, the man who'd offered them the resignation in lieu of termination 8 years ago, who provided the evening's most revealing moment. He approached them near the bar, drink in hand, and his face showed the slight flush of alcohol and awkwardness. Park. Okafor, he said, nodding to each of them. I wanted to say, the company has evolved since your time. We've updated our policies on crew relationships. They're more nuanced now, less absolute. How progressive, Adanna said, her voice carefully neutral. I'm just saying, if the same situation happened today, it might be handled differently. But it didn't happen today, Ji-hoon said. It happened 8 years ago, and you terminated 2 people who'd done nothing wrong except fall in love. And that decision changed our entire lives. The supervisor looked uncomfortable. Company policy at the time was unjust, Ji-hoon finished. You know it was. And you enforced it anyway because it was easier than standing up for what was right. I had a responsibility to the airline. And we had lives, Adanna interjected. Careers we'd built. Futures we'd planned. All of it destroyed because we made the mistake of being human. The supervisor opened his mouth, closed it again. Then, quietly, I am sorry. For whatever that's worth now. It's worth exactly what you think it is, Ji-hoon replied. Which is to say, very little. But I appreciate you saying it. The supervisor nodded and walked away, and Adanna squeezed Ji-hoon's hand. Well, she said. That felt better than I expected. Did it? Not really, Adanna admitted. But at least it's said now. At least he knows we know he was wrong. They stayed for another hour, accepting congratulations from people who were genuinely pleased to see them thrive, enduring judgment from those who still viewed their relationship as a scandal. And when they finally left the gala, walking out into the Seoul night with the city lights painting the sky above them, Ji-hoon felt the weight of the past shift and lighten. I thought coming here would feel like victory, he said as they waited for their driver. Like we'd proven something to all of them. And instead I just feel tired. They don't matter anymore. Their judgment, their approval, their regret, none of it changes what we built or who we became. Adanna leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. That's the real victory, she said. Not that they see us as successful, but that we don't need them to. The car arrived, and they drove home through the city they'd made their own, past the airport where they'd once worked, through streets they'd walked during the hardest years when success seemed impossible. And Ji-hoon thought about the long journey from that first moment in the cockpit when he'd seen Adanna and felt something shift, to this moment now, survivors and partners and the architects of a life no one had thought they'd be able to build. Do you ever miss it? Adanna asked as they neared their house. Flying, I mean. The actual work of it. Ji-hoon considered the question honestly. Sometimes, he admitted. I miss the precision of it, the way everything had a clear protocol and outcome. I miss the view from the flight deck, the particular solitude of being above the weather. But I don't miss the person I was when I was doing it. That version of me was so careful, so controlled, so afraid of making mistakes that he never made choices at all. And now? Now I make mistakes constantly, Ji-hoon said with a smile. But they're my mistakes. My choices. Our life. Our life, Adanna repeated, and the words felt like a victory more profound than any business success or financial milestone. They'd started with nothing but love and need and the desperate determination to survive. They'd been told their relationship was forbidden, impossible, doomed to fail. They'd lost everything the world said defined them, their careers, their professional identities, the respect of their colleagues. They'd been judged and found wanting by systems designed to keep people like them apart. And they'd survived anyway. Not through some miraculous redemption or easy happy ending, but through the grinding, unglamorous work of building something new from ruins. Through choosing each other when it would have been easier to walk away. Through the messy, complicated, often painful process of creating a life that was theirs. The house lights were on when they pulled into the driveway. Home. A word that meant something now, something solid and real and earned. "Thank you," Ji-hoon said as they sat in the car for a moment before going inside. For what? For not giving up. On us. On everything. There were so many moments when you could have walked away, should have walked away. But you stayed. We stayed, Adanna corrected. You stayed too. Through my anger and my grief and all the times I was impossible to love. You stayed. You were never impossible to love, Ji-hoon said. Loving you was the easiest thing I ever did. It was everything else that was hard. They went inside together, into the house they'd bought with money they'd earned together, filled with furniture they'd chosen together, marked by the small evidences of a shared life, photos on the walls, books on shelves. The coffee maker programmed to brew at 6 a.m. for both of them. In the bedroom, getting ready for sleep, Adanna caught sight of herself in the mirror and paused. She saw the gray hair she'd stopped dyeing, the lines around her eyes from years of smiling and crying and living. She saw the expensive pajamas that success had afforded her, but also the scars on her hands from those early days of cleaning, permanent marks from chemicals and hard work. "What are you thinking?" Ji-hoon asked, coming up behind her. "I'm thinking about the woman I was in that cockpit 9 years ago," Adanna said. "When I first met you. How scared I was. How small I'd made myself. How certain I was that my life would be an endless series of serving others and making myself acceptable to people who'd never fully accept me. And now? Now I'm thinking about how wrong she would have been if she'd walked past you that day without looking back. If she'd followed all the rules and stayed safe and never risked anything for love." Ji-hoon kissed the side of her neck, a gesture of tenderness that still made her shiver after all these years. "She was brave," he said. "That woman. She was so much braver than she knew." "We both were," Adanna replied. "We just didn't realize it until we had no other choice." They climbed into bed, and in the darkness of their bedroom, in the house they'd built from disaster, Adanna felt the particular peace that came from knowing she'd survived everything meant to destroy her. Not unscathed, the scars were there, would always be there. But survived. Transformed. Stronger in the broken places. "I love you," Ji-hoon whispered in the darkness, the same words he'd said to her in hotel rooms across 5 continents, in the tiny apartment when they'd had nothing, in the moments of despair and triumph and every ordinary day in between. "I love you too," Adanna whispered back, and the words carried the weight of everything they meant, not just romantic love, but the love that came from choosing someone over and over, from building a life together from ruins, from refusing to let the world's judgment define their worth. Outside, Seoul continued its endless motion, planes taking off and landing at Incheon, flight crews beginning and ending their shifts, passengers moving through terminals, the machinery of aviation turning without them. Pacific Wings was flying its routes, hiring new pilots and flight attendants, maintaining the rules and hierarchies that had once destroyed 2 careers over a forbidden love. But Ji-hoon and Adanna were here, in their home, in the life they'd created. Not bitter, not defined by what had been taken from them, but shaped by what they'd chosen to build instead. They'd been told their love was forbidden, impossible, destined to fail. The world had tried to crush them for daring to cross boundaries, for refusing to accept the limits others placed on who they could love and how they could live. And they'd survived it all. Together. Scarred but standing. Transformed by the fire but not consumed by it. That was the real victory, not the money or the business success or the social validation of their story. but the simple, profound fact that they'd been given every reason to give up and had chosen, day after day, to keep going, to keep choosing each other, to keep building, to keep loving. In the darkness, their hands found each other, and they slept, two people who'd fallen from the sky and learned to build a new life on solid ground.